Hey there, and welcome to the Dynamics Hot Dish Podcast, serving up stories and knowledge on Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform. This is what's hot in Dynamics. You're now joining Merlin Schweiger, Liz McGlennon, and Ashley Steiner.
Liz, how have you never heard of WandaVision?
I don't even know what you're talking about. I can't even
imagine you haven't, I can understand if you're like, oh, I'm not watching WandaVision, but to not even be aware of it.
So it's a TV show.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nope.
I mean, if
Disney
you want to
Plus.
make it sound so simple, yes, it's a TV show, but it is so much more.
You have to remember, my social interactions are a lot more limited now to COVID.
You use Google, it's all over the internet.
Have you heard of the internet? There's news?
Actually, I've been trying to stay off social media and stuff lately, so.
Okay, well, let's educate you on WandaVision.
All right. Are you familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or MCU?
Yes.
Okay. You've watched some of those movies?
Yes, most of them.
Okay.
So you
Are
know who
aware?
Wanda and Vision are?
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
Good. So there's a show that is the two of them, and it's like a show about a show, I guess, of them living in a suburban sitcom.
Oh.
And it takes you
Basically.
through the different decades. It starts in the 50s, and then you slowly see it progress. And I don't want to give anything away, because if people are listening to this and haven't watched it, I don't want to give away anything.
Yeah. Well, and I haven't finished it yet.
Okay, so I won't say anything, because I watch it on Fridays, the moment I'm done working, which will not be the case for Loki. I will wake up at 1 a.m. and watch Loki when that comes out in May.
Okay.
But yeah, so WandaVision, I can't believe you haven't watched it or heard of it.
I think now that you describe it, I might have seen it advertised, or I think I've seen it once advertised, but no, I haven't.
Oh,
I had
it's
completely
worth
forgotten
watching.
about it. What is it on?
It's on Disney Plus.
Okay.
With the rest of the Marvel
I
content.
have that.
And then Hawkeye, what's the next one? It's not Hawkeye, it's the other. Yeah, no.
Actually, no.
It's so the next one includes the guy who the Captain America gave his, oh my gosh, I'm giving so much away. I don't want to say that.
No, it's Falcon and
Falcon.
And it is Hawkeye, isn't it?
Is it Hawkeye? No, I don't remember. Anyway, so that one comes out in March as well. So
yeah.
So
Disney Plus is definitely rocking it this year.
Speaking of Disney Plus, because of our previous chit chat about favorite movies, Merlin, I've been meaning to tell you that I rewatched Fantasia based on your recommendation last weekend.
And was it as terrible as you remembered from when you were 5?
It was better, but I still fell asleep during it. I made it almost to the end. I made it to the demon scene, but no, it was better than I remembered.
Maybe I'll have to rewatch it. That's a good.
Just saying,
I can fall asleep in my recliner watching.
You
There
can,
you go.
Ashley.
You can get a nice rest in there.
Oh my gosh, that's funny.
Should we talk about our topic for the day?
I could talk
I
about
suppose.
WandaVision forever, so better switch me now.
No spoilers though. Okay, so we're gonna be kind of piggybacking off our previous PM project management discussion and talking about timelines and budgets for projects.
So strap in, kids. It's going to be exciting.
Yeah. So my first question to you both is, can a project stay on time and in budget? Because I think we see so many times where they don't. So is it possible? And maybe let's talk about how to keep it on track, or what causes it to get off track.
I think the biggest answer is scope creep, but also working in an agile way that I do constantly. Nothing is really, I don't want to say it's not out of scope, but it's your scope changes as you're developing and working on it, because something that may have you didn't know in the beginning is now a requirement or needs to be considered. So I've grown up with this whole term of scope creep, but now it nothing is really off the table as long as it solves the solution. It's all about the outcome in the end. But it might just lengthen the number of sprints you have or things like that. So that's where the timeline becomes really hard. You just have to make sure that you're delivering something by the first deliverable. Hey, this also got added in. I'm actually working on a project right now where this happened. And, so we had to like reevaluate what our MVP scope was in order to still meet that first timeline.
Right.
And something got shifted around and said, oh, we'll wait for the next phase to do this part because this thing came in.
Yeah, you're kind of trading, like you're reprioritizing, like we pulled this thing in, so to stick to our timeline, we have to push something out.
Yeah.
Which
I think Agile really helps actually with that, because in Waterfall, there's scope creep is a 4-letter word.
Or it's a work order and we're pushing back go live and we need more money.
Right.
Like a change request. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, when you asked that question, my first thought was, well, are we talking an Agile project or are we talking a Waterfall project? Because I think in an Agile project, it's super easy to stick to your timeline and budget. You just say, well, I've got this many sprints. That's my timeline. That's my budget. But you might not get all the functionality that you realize you need along the line. And so then it's a question of, well, do I throw out some functionality that I think that I need so that I can stay on the timeline, or do I actually need it so I have to extend the timeline and therefore the budget? I don't know, isn't this like the iron triangle thing, right? Like you got your scope, your timeline, and your budget, and if there's a change, something's got to give.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to have all three on every project. Perfect. I mean, I don't know if I've ever been on a project where all three, where we started and thought the timeline, budget, and scope was going to be, is where we ended. I honestly don't even have anything in mind. Either the timeline is pushed because it was necessary, or the budget increased in order to still meet the timeline, or the scope was cut and you turned it into like multiple phases. And this is, I mean, I'm working in an agile environment now, but that's very waterfall-esque, I would say.
It's true. I think I could probably come up with one example, but it was work that lasted fewer than 3 days. Right?
That doesn't count. That's not a project.
If it's this big, it could be a project.
Merlin,
I had to change a dashboard once, Merlin, and I did meet that within scope, budget, and timeline.
See? So it's possible. So you're saying there's a chance.
Doesn't count.
But I mean, Ashley, you're right. There's basically no way for all of those things to stay the same, because none of us, at least as far as I'm aware, can see into the future. And so you don't actually know what's going to come up next week. Like the business need could change. Like a new market opportunity could appear and the sales VP is like, okay, we got to capitalize on this now. So now I need to make these changes to the system that's already in flight. Or, somebody gets sick and now they can't do their portion of the input. And so now your timeline is pushed, or like something's going to happen.
Merlin, I think that's a really good point. Like sometimes just stuff happens that are out of your control, and it might not be, hey, we're adding scope or something that causes it. Like to your point, like someone could get sick or leave, and that just kind of throws the timeline out of whack. And that's something you can't really do anything about. It just happens.
So one that I always think of like out of your control are the waves, because you have no idea what Microsoft is going to include in that next wave that might solve your problem. Because I've seen that happen before where the release notes come out and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm halfway through a project that was customizing all this that now Microsoft is coming out with. So you have to make that decision of, can I wait, the 4 to 6 months that it's going to take, for Microsoft to actually put it in the timeline or whatever, or do I still continue my custom build and finish it? That can also change things. It happens a lot. I'm actually, it happened, I haven't did not invest any time into this, but notifications is something everybody asks for. And so I had it on my Q1 timeline to figure out a way to do notifications, pop-up notifications in Dynamics. Release notes got released in, January. Pop-up notifications are coming this summer. So I said, putting that off to the side, and I will wait till Microsoft, you know what I mean? So it's one of those things where it can completely reprioritize what your plans are.
I totally agree. I also think that's the release notes and just the frequency of changes is another reason not to do waterfall. Because if you're saying like, hey, we're going to use X, Y, and Z existing functionality and we'll build it like 6 months from now, that design decision might have to completely change, or
If
it
it gets
should change
deprecated.
or get deprecated, or like there's better new functionality. So I think that's another reason not to go with waterfall.
Well, I think that happened. I asked you guys, what do you guys know about task flows? And you're like, Ashley, that's getting deprecated. So it's like one of those things where like, just because you see it in the system right now, it's not the best thing to move forward on.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it happens. And I would say that's really specific to maybe Dynamics and Power Platform. I'm not sure that other softwares like get changes that often, but it's in our space. So
Some do, like it's Salesforce does that
Yeah.
too. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess I was thinking of like an ERP system. I guess F&O and Business Central get changes on the waves, but
Mm-hmm.
They do, but again, there's only so many ways to do a general ledger or accounts payable. Like maybe you want to add a new feature, but you're not going to like fundamentally change how like double entry accounting works.
right.
Okay, let's get back on topic. So we're talking about timeline and budget and agile and waterfall. Do you feel like the tools you use to manage and track that change, like based on the type of project methodology that you're using, or do you think the tools are consistent regardless of it?
I mean, for managing a timeline?
Yeah, like do you always use Microsoft Project or do you always use whatever?
I mean, I always use Jira
Mm-hmm.
because then you can easily move things in and out of sprint, or hey, you know what, this came up, so you're too much workload now, you have to like back something out. It really helps with that. I know you guys brought up like Azure Devops or project. I think project to me is very waterfall because you're planning so far out into the future, where like in agile you're thinking, okay, what am I going to do in these next 2 weeks in order to still meet my outcome that's down the road. So yeah, so I mean, I use the tool. That's how I help stay on timeline, or at least still meet that objective that you're reaching towards in that first phase, second phase, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time thinking about how I would use Microsoft Project in an agile fashion. I mean, I guess you could, like you just only fill in the parts that you have so far and just sort of like keep kicking it out. I'm just not sure that it would be a very effective tool because I don't feel like it was designed to run a project that way. Similarly, Azure DevOps is, yeah, I don't think it would be that efficient. But like DevOps is more designed for a more agile project. But I think you could still use it to run a waterfall project. You just end up putting in more up front, right? Like I would just put in more design information at the beginning instead of sort of doing it along the way.
And I'll say what I've found working in an agile environment is that scope is usually the thing that gets changed. And I guess it's timeline. It's hard to say, but it's like as things come in, you just move things to another phase. So it's not that like you're not getting what you want in the end. You can still do it on budget. It's just that the order of what you're going to do things in changes. Or, hey, I'm going to meet this. You gave me a timeline of Q1, we can do this in Q1, and then we're going to do this in Q2. So is that not meeting your timeline because you're still delivering something in Q1, right? So it's like, I don't know. I think it all makes that subjective. The only hard thing here is the budget because it's dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So I think you could use the same tools, but some tools are going to be more efficient or less efficient depending on the type of project that you're doing. And then I think it also ties into like how are you tracking your budget, and how are you tracking the work that is done and how much time that's taken, because of course time is basically what ties back to your budget. So how are you doing that time? And like if you're doing pure agile and you're only tracking like story points, then story points don't necessarily tie directly to time, then you might need a different mechanism to tell you how your budget's doing. But
Merlin, I think you should explain story points.
I don't know if I'm the best person to explain story points.
Well, you
but
brought them up.
I did. The idea being that in an agile environment, if you're very pure agile, the way that you determine like how many things you can do in a sprint, one of those ways could be story points, where you allocate a number of points to a thing that has to be built, and those points are based on essentially how much work it's going to take, but not necessarily tied to hours. So the idea is, historically based on our burn down rate, we can do 40 story points per sprint. And so then you identify like this task is 10 points, this task is 20 points, this task is 2 points. And so you fill up your sprint with 40 story points and say, all right, great, off you go. But it doesn't necessarily mean like a point is not a unit of hours necessarily. And I admit I'm a little bit fuzzy on how you determine points, but maybe Ashley can tell me more.
Is it difficulty or is it like importance?
It's not priority.
Yeah, so those are two different things. So then I would think it would be
complexity.
Difficulty. Yeah, complexity of actually completing that.
Yeah.
Right. The idea being, of course, that you can't take like 3 super complex problems and hammer them out in 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you can do part of one.
I don't see story points used very often. I guess the way I'm more used to estimating user stories or work during an agile project is literally by hours or t-shirt sizing it. So just like small, medium, large, extra large.
Right. I think story points extends the t-shirt size to give you more variability. Like I said, I'm not really sure. I admit I don't fully understand how to calculate what a story point means.
I also I guess I struggle with what kind of scale. So do you just determine the scale on your own and then how many story points you can have in a given sprint? Is it just up to the, okay. I've never used them. I've always used t-shirt sizes. Is this a small, medium, or large effort?
No,
the idea would be you start,
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, the idea is you figure out what your points mean. You start assigning points to your user stories. You run a few sprints, and then you see how many points you've accomplished in those sprints. And then that defines okay, that's my burn down rate is 40 points per sprint. Now I know that for future planning. But it's all very pure, like a dev team style agile. I've also never used them myself. I just know that they're there. Sorry.
No, so Merlin, the point you're trying to make is you kind of benchmark your first sprint or two, and then once you have this established, then you kind of know your scale or what they actually equate to.
Right. And in a Dynamics implementation that's only running for 4 to 6 months, that might not make any sense because you might not have enough sprints, right? It's going to take you 2 or 3 sprints to get your baseline. So now you're a month and a half in already before you've even got your baseline. Is it really that valuable? But if you're doing I don't know, if you're developing Windows for 6 years, then it's probably more valuable.
Which is probably why we don't use them very much for our Dynamics Power Platform projects.
Yeah, because I also want to say, I think that, oh gosh, I lost what I was going to say when you mentioned developing Windows for 6 years, because that sounded terrible to me.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Does anybody track their budget in anything that's not an Excel spreadsheet?
I don't track my budget. Somebody else does it, so I have no idea how they do it.
I haven't seen it tracked anywhere else. Have you?
I feel I think it's either in Excel or it's you're pulling a report out of whatever you're putting your time entry in, right?
Essentially that report is almost always Excel anyways.
Yeah, that's probably true too.
So from a time entry perspective, I've always found that the system is pretty difficult to report out. I've always had PMs be well, it's really hard to report out of the time entry system, so I'm just going to keep it in a spreadsheet too. So
that's a different problem. We could probably solve that with a Power App.
Well, I think it depends on what you use. Isn't project service or field service really? I've used project service, I think, before to track hours, and it's pretty easy to pull it out.
Yeah. It's true. I'm not actually sure that field service does time entry out of the box. I feel like that's one of the gaps that they tell me about. But yeah, I feel like this is what I've seen, right? Is you put your time entry into your ERP system or whatever, payroll system is running time entry, and then you spit those numbers out to somewhere, and then the PM aggregates those on a spreadsheet and says, okay, here's how we're doing against budget.
So that sounds very consulted. right? That is like what you
Yeah.
guys are describing is the very consultant way to track hours and time. It's completely different like for an end user, right? Because I don't bill my hours back to my company for that project, right? So I actually don't even track the money or you know what I'm saying? I don't track hours that way. I guess when you say budgets, I think of, are we on budget with our vendor?
Yeah, you're
Like-
making sure the consultants on track budget-wise. Yeah.
Yeah. Cause I don't like, cause I'll put in as many hours as I have to because I'm salaried, right? So if I have to work 70 hours this week in order to stay on track, I can do that. But I don't want my consultant to work 70 hours this week to stay on track.
So Ashley, if you're like working on a user story though, for like that like you are building something, do you not log like your actual hours spent on the interesting?
I don't,
Okay.
we do not today. Not that it couldn't happen.
Mhm.
I've worked at companies where they wanted you to track your hours for, you know, because they had billable people and they couldn't separate it for whatever reason. And so you did, but
Well, and
I
I'm
don't
not
track.
even saying like entering it into a time entry, like an ERP system. I'm saying
Right.
like logging it in Jira, for example, or
Yeah, no.
DevOps. Yeah.
I don't put it in.
Huh.
So then
I don't
you
know if
have
I'd
no
wanna know.
idea. So then you have no idea how long it's taken you to do something after the fact.
No idea.
Hmm.
Because, you know, I guess on our end, it's not billable, right? So I don't want to say we don't care.
But
it's
you
just as long as the
your
work gets
time
done.
is still worth like a dollar amount. Like you're still getting
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Right.
Like I still think that if I were internal, like leading an internal team, like I would still be interested in knowing like kind of the efficiency, or there's still a cost equated to it. It's just not like as direct of an expense.
Mhm.
It's true. I feel like
Agree, 'cause
maybe
when
take
you-
a page out of like call centers.
Yeah, well, because like you think about like I kick off a project, I still have a day job, right? Like I still manage users, I work with them, I do training, I troubleshoot. So when I kick off a large project, like I literally just kicked off a large project 2 weeks ago, that's gonna cut into the amount of time in theory of how much I can like work with users and troubleshoot and things like that. Now, as somebody who works in an end user company, you typically just work more hours to make it all happen, rather than saying, oh, if I take on this, I'm going to have this many less hours to do the other, like my day job.
Yeah.
Sure.
Whereas in a consultant world, you plan all that out so that you're only billing X amount of hours per week. You know, you're not working the 70 hours, hopefully.
Presumably. Or if you are, then you're just making more money, right?
Right.
Right.
But that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's your choice, I
Yeah.
guess, to take it on. Whereas like at a end user, you just have to make it all work, regardless of how much time it is. And that might just be my overachievingness of how much I work. I hope not everybody is like me.
See, so what I would hope for, even for end users and for you personally, Ashley, is that if you're doing so much work, it is valuable to keep track of how much that time is so that you could find somewhere else to offload it to, whether that is offload it to the partner and say, look, I don't have time to do these things. Maybe the partner can do those things, or maybe somebody else internally can do those things, or maybe you need to hire a new position. Because I think if you're not tracking sort of your own budgetary inputs, then the organization can't know how much they've really spent on it, right? Like, because they've spent whatever the consultant is billing them, but they're not, if they have no visibility to how much time it's cost internally, then they don't really have a true picture of the actual cost of the organization, which means that all of those like ROI calculations that the sales guy sold them on at the start, like, are either skewed or impossible to say one way or the other.
Yeah.
And I feel like
that's
from
a
an
good point.
organizational perspective, that's important to know.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I know, like, Merlin, that's a really good point. And I think that's kind of a missing piece to the ROI. Like, when, as a consultant, when the customer's like, well, what's the ROI on this? And it's like, I can give you the consulting costs, but if you're not willing to track it on your side, we can't really tell you that for you. Like, you also need to track your internal resources, time. Yeah.
Right.
Am I the only one who feels like this turned into a therapy session for Ashley? You work too much.
No,
I feel like Ashley, you work too much.
And actually, you made a comment like, oh, a consultant gets to choose if they do more than a 40-hour week. And that's not always the case. So,
yeah, and I wouldn't know, right? I'd have very limited experience.
Yeah.
A lot of times a consultant doesn't get, control or asked like what project or projects they're put on. And so if their manager decides to like overextend them, it's not like something they always would opt in for.
Gotcha.
That's true.
Okay. Any final thoughts on timelines or budgets?
I don't know. They're just so exciting to me.
It's just hard, right? Because something has to give. And so you have to decide as a company, like what are you willing to give up? I like Merlin said, our 3-day projects of updating a dashboard are the only ones we can think of that, where all 3 were still correct at the end. So
Yeah. Expect change.
Yeah. And do you feel like, oh, go ahead, Ashley.
No, go ahead, Liz.
I was just going to ask, like, do you feel like when you start a project that expectation is set up front? Or do you feel like you always start a project like, this is going to stay in scope, in time, and on budget, even though we kind of all know, like, that's not realistic? Like, does anyone actually talk about that or admit that initially? Or do you admit it once it changes?
It's funny because like working with vendors, I always tell them, we're going to do this in scope, on time, and within budget. Right. But like the work, like if we're taking on the work internally or if like we're doing this part, we're like, because we're such an agile shop, like we know it's going to change and we know that like things need to be flexible, but like I still hold my partners accountable to, no, you're going to do this on time, unless, something completely like really changes. But
isn't that kind of a double standard? Like if you're changing it and you don't expect to stick to it internally and you influence them, like how can you say? No, but that's what I'm saying.
It's like from the beginning I set that expectation, but then like as we do it ongoing, like it does change and you're and you understand, right? Like, oh, hey, I know this is gonna not meet the timeline anymore because we changed X or Y or whatever.
Actually, how would you react if your partner, like at the beginning, was like, that one of these 3 is going to give during the project, right?
I would say I agree with you. Yeah.
But you are a reasonable understanding.
And it better not be budget. I'd rather go a little shorter or longer in time or whatever, everything else. I'd rather decrease scope to stay on budget.
That's a good point. Like a good question though, because for you it's budget, but like I've definitely worked with clients that could say it's scope or it's timeline. So like I wonder if maybe we should be having that conversation more of like, what is the thing that's most important to you?
And it might change from project to project, right? Like on some projects you might say, I have to fit all this scope. If that's what you're estimating in that, but it goes over, just let me know that we're going to go over,
Right.
So it's going to change. And I kid around a lot with like, oh, I told my partner we have to stay. I do have those conversations with my current partner. Like, hey, this is what's most important for this project. And let's make sure that part at least stays. And then let's talk about the rest as it goes on. Because I work in an agile shop. Now, when I worked in a waterfall shop, it was completely different.
Mm-hmm. I think that's good that you're having that conversation.
Yeah.
It's a good point, Liz. I'm going to incorporate that now into my sales process and be like, guys, something's going to change. Just tell me which one of these you don't want to change. Because sometimes it's I need to be able to do this by this date. And whatever it costs,
a drop dead date.
That's what it has to be, right?
Yeah, like my Salesforce contract ends in 6 months and we have to be off it by this. Like there's definitely, each project has one thing that's like the top priority. Absolutely.
Yep. Or this is all the money we've got. So whatever we can get done in this money, that's all we can do.
Right.
Absolutely.
Or this is critical functionality that we must have to run our business. So the scope is the most important.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm so glad we can help improve your sales process, Merlin.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just going to take some notes right here.
You're welcome.
So my only other lasting thought was the name of the new show on Disney Plus is Falcon and the Winter Soldier. It was bothering me our entire podcast. Winter Soldier.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Thank you.
It's Bucky. So
you guys are dorks.
I only got into the MCU world because of COVID, so I don't totally blame COVID for this one.
Mm-hmm.
Liz over there pretending she's not a dork.
I'm not. Well, on that note, thanks for watching.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to the Dynamics Hot Dish podcast. For additional content and previous episodes, check out our website at dynamicshotdish.com, follow us on Twitter at dynamicshotdish, and subscribe to our podcast for notifications. Thanks. See you next time.